Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor, please subscribe if you haven't already. Yes indeed, time for another rock and read. Today we'll read chapter 11 of My Effin Life by Geddy Lee. Let's see what happens next. 2 nights after the Massey Hall show, we moved our gear into Toronto Sound to record our 3rd album, Caress of Steel. We would have 3 whole luxurious weeks to do so. It was summer, and we were feeling pretty upbeat, despite the ambitious task we had set for ourselves. Our first concept album. Well, half of one anyway. The prospect of all that studio time was intoxicating, and quite literally went to our heads. We were in possession of a goodly supply of hash and hash oil to spur on our creative juices. But, as the author and radio personality Earl Nightingale once said, "Wherever there is danger, there lurks opportunity. Wherever there is opportunity, there lurks danger." For us, the second half of that clever remark was the most apt. One afternoon, as we sat on the long couch at the back of the control room, the heavy scent of hemp wafting around, one of the most eccentric people I've ever known, the late Canadian musician, painter, writer, Mendelssohn Joe, dropped in. He watched Workst, Pratt, and me discussing ideas while mic setups were changed, discussing some more song ideas while amps were EQ'd, discussing yet more ideas in readiness for the next overdub. What he saw was next to nothing going down on tape, and as he left, he turned to me and said, with his inimitable, only half-joking bluntness, "Well, you guys really know how to waste time." I remember thinking what a funny guy he was, but in retrospect, I got that wrong. He wasn't kidding at all. With 3 weeks of paid studio time and a guaranteed record release, we were squandering an opportunity that he and so many of our musician pals would have wanted. This is why that spur to our creative juices came to be known amongst us as our impedimenta. Some music critics have noted that consecutive decades of rock music might be characterized to some extent by the most popular substances of the day. In our case, it was an inordinate amount of hash oil. Caress of Steel is a really dry record. When I listen back to it, there's a lot less echo on it than we thought there was when we were listening back in the studio. The fact is, we were so high that it sounded more reverberant than it actually was. As the years progressed, we would become so integrally involved in our studio album's recording process, no matter who was at the helm, that they'd all be credited as co-productions. But more than anyone during the Caress of Steel sessions, I was the nudnik, sitting at the console beside Terry and constantly piping up with ideas. My new favorite question was, "Terry, what if we tried?" as well as, "Terry, shouldn't there be more repeats on Alex's guitar? Terry, what if..." I know I was annoying, but hey, I was feeling my oats and wanted to try out all the ideas that were popping into my head. I wouldn't go so far as to say that over the years I drove producers and engineers a little crazy, but, well, yeah, let's say I did. I'd watch every little thing with an eagle eye, trying to understand and remember every flick of a switch, leaping on people if they forgot to do the smallest thing, demanding explanations for everything. I couldn't help myself, and I've always been the same. It's partly a matter of control, partly, depending on who we'd be working with, a lack of trust, but most important, it's a compulsion to exhaust every possibility to make the perfect record. I don't want to have to live with errors. Impossible, I know, but what's the point of not shooting for the moon? Caress of Steel was conceived as 2 distinct sides. One, a collection of disconnected songs to rock out and satisfy our need for diversity. The other, well, we had some lofty ideas. Before I get to those, I'll deliver on my promise of explaining I Think I'm Going Bald, another song born of a joke. It was partly a piss take on the title of a Kiss song we liked, Going Blind, and partly about the fear of aging, but mainly about Alex. On tour at the time, he was skinny as a rail, with long, luscious hair, but was really afraid of going bald. The root, so to speak, of his anxiety was that his dad had lost most of his hair at a fairly young age, and for some reason hung up on getting fat. He was always on some bad diet. Neil and I once tasted the diet fresca he obsessively drank and went, "Hoo!" You know, making a hurling sound. And from then on, Howard made sure Lurks always had diet "Hoo!" in the dressing room. This led to a tongue-in-cheek lyric about youthful vanity, but also how to our generation, long hair was a symbol of defiance. In the last couplet, even when I'm gray, I'll be gray my way, we were having fun, but also referring to how we'd have to push back against criticism of our evolving style on Fly By Night. Little did we know that after the release of Caress of Steel, that pressure would only get more intense. We'd also been working on a lengthy song of Neil's called The Fountain of Lamneth, an unabashed deep dive into the world of concept albums such as Foxtrot and Nursery Crime by Genesis, and Rick Wakeman's Journey to the Center of the Earth, with aspirations to the intricacy of such pieces as Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick and Close to the Edge by Yes. Of course, we were nowhere near as accomplished as any of those epic bands, but we desperately wanted to be. Some critics called Caress of Steel derivative. Fair enough. Our influences were obvious. Like most aspiring musicians, we were impressionable and desperate to emulate the players we admired, many of whom were still recording and performing live, and inevitably, there were times when we paled in comparison with the real thing. We're all subconsciously influenced by our heroes, but sometimes you don't realize quite how blatant your mimicry is until your music is out there for the world to hear and review. Like the time that Alex started playing us a new riff he was clearly proud of, but stopped when he saw Pratt and me grinning at each other. He went, "What? Dude, you just wrote Little Wing." No one likes being compared with other bands, and comparison is definitely the lazy critic's tool, but we were all inescapably a product of what we ingest. I think of it as going through periods of input, then output. I'll be listening to all kinds of stuff for a while, but when I start to write, I have to put it away. When I'm writing or recording other people's music, even in a restaurant or an elevator, feels like an intrusion and presents a danger too. In my desire to create work that's as pure as possible, I get so single-minded that I can't even focus on reading novels. Fact-based stuff is fine, but I don't have the patience for anything that demands imagination. I remember times during a playback when I'd hear a word I'd just sung or pronounced a certain way and realized it sounded way too much like some singer I admired. It could have been anyone from Steve Marriott to Joni Mitchell to Björk, whom I'd subconsciously channeled, perhaps just in that one word. But in the end, I'd leave it as is, as a nod to my heroes and a kind of Easter egg that only I knew was there. But it begs the question, doesn't it? When can you say you've achieved a sound or a style all your own? It's basically when your influences have become so diverse that they're no longer easy to trace. They blended together so thoroughly as to create a stew of your own making. But that's not enough. In my view, it requires a diversity of influences and the strength of your individual character. I was a big fan of Amazing Blondell, the Strawbs, and other bands in the English folk rock tradition. My pal Oscar and I both love that Baroque approach to acoustic guitar, and the first great acoustic I bought was a nylon string Martin because I was trying to emulate that plucking style. Elizabethan tones and melodies had a romantic allure for me too. So it was natural for me to slip that into the stuff we wrote. Plus, I dug the way Jethro Tull took a variety of classical influences and rocked them up. Complementing all that was the Tolkien and fantasy literature we were reading at the time. We folded it into our music to take it beyond your standard blues rock. We were like sponges. Anything we could soak up from another band had a place in Rush. If it knocked us out, it had a place in our music. I really believe this is what happens with every artist. The more influences one has that are then filtered through one's own personality, the more one ends up with a style and a sound that one can legitimately call one's own. If you have 3 bands influencing you, you're derivative. If you have 100, you're original. It does take time, though. To be honest, we didn't really consider ourselves to have a sound of our own until 2112, though there were moments like with Biter, when we said to one another, "Ooh, nobody's stupid enough to have done this before." We were tasting the stew and spicing it up, bit by bit. We were our own target audience, writing music for ourselves on the assumption that there were enough people out there with the same sensibility as us who would dig it too. Our chops were getting better, that was clear, but of course, I wasn't entirely happy, and never would be with any record we'd make. I'd always be thinking, okay, it sounds good, but God, why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do that? That's why I came up with the expression, with thanks to Woody Allen, mixing is the end of hope. I was always in hell during a mix because I wanted it perfect. It was like I heard too much. I sensed too many options. For years I imagined that everyone else was to blame for not finding that perfect balance. But now I know that it's the nature of the beast. Mixing is compromise. I've also always found final playbacks painful. I don't hear what I've succeeded at, only my failures. I walk away from it with a kind of postpartum depression. Post-production blues, we call it. I suffer from a combination of addiction to the perfect moment, plus option anxiety. I go so far as to hate a record for a while, because all I hear are experiments that didn't amount to a hill of beans. At album launch parties or sitting captive during a radio station interview when the DJ plays a track, I'd always sit there just crushing my fingers, churning inside over all the things I thought could be improved. Gradually, though, the pain subsides as you start to hear the work more objectively for what it actually is. You still hear it, warts and all, but those warts aren't quite as big and hairy as you feared. With our latest albums, Vapor Trails in particular, I'd stop working on a mix only when it was wrested from my hands. Then, the only way out of the depression would be to think, well, on the next album. If I felt I had up verses on the previous album, I'd focus on the dynamics of the verses for the next. Sometimes you're chasing your tail, but you always need that one thing to bring you back to the studio. I cannot stress enough how important it was for us to get better at expressing the ideas we had in our heads, and how much it drove me. I couldn't wait for another chance to improve on myself, pushing to make my influences broader, searching for knowledge, raising my game. For me, that's still what it's all about. When Corrosive Steel was finished, we let the office hear it, and, well, let's just say that no champagne corks were popped. They were clearly perplexed. Their disappointment was palpable. They didn't get the Fountain of Lamneth at all. And when they took it to Chicago for Mercury to hear, things got worse. Ray and Vic went into damage control mode. Knowing there was a tour imminent and that everybody needed to earn some money, they put on a game face and went to battle for us. I have to give it to them. They were total professionals in that regard. It was decided that Lakeside Park would be our first single, with Bastille Day on the flip side. It got some airplay in the States, more in Canada, but as we prepared to take it on the road, Caress of Steel looked unlikely to surpass the sales of Fly By Night, and we knew we had a steep hill to climb. I'm not inclined to reprint any of the bad reviews we received, but I will say that concept albums and prog rock inevitably bring the word pretentious to critics' minds, and in the coming months our critics would bandy it about with relish. Neil and I discussed between ourselves what it really means to be pretentious. The dictionary defines it as attempting to impress by affecting greater importance, talent, culture, etc. than is actually possessed. We struggled with that. Was that really us? We opted for a kinder interpretation. If the word implied that we were pretending something, well, no. We were not pretending, just trying. Maybe our reach exceeded our grasp, but we were earnestly trying to write music with a literary inflection. We were attempting to be deeper and more complex than your average rock group. Sure, we were bombastic, but we weren't pretending to be anything else. And if we aimed for the stars, but hadn't quite enough rocket fuel to get there, so what? No one was going to stop us from trying. We were prepared to learn from well-written criticism, but many of those earlier reviews were ill-informed, badly written, or just slagging off a band they didn't think was going to make it anyway. I mean, we were even called devil worshippers. For the most part, we took note of certain markers. This guy just hates us, so we're not going to bother with him. Although Neil wrote a rare rebuttal to Robert Christgau at the Village Voice, who called us the most obnoxious band currently on the zonk teen circuit. Well, to riff on George Bernard Shaw, those that can, do. Those that can't, teach. And Woody Allen, those that can't teach, teach Jim. Those that can't do either, write rock and roll reviews. In any case, I've always tended to believe neither the bad reviews nor the ones that overflowed with compliments. I could always find flaws in my own work, thank you. So if a writer loved a song so much so that he felt there was nothing wrong with it, to me, that was no more believable than dismissing it as garbage. We had won some goodwill from past year's gigs and kicked off the fall by opening for Nazareth in Western Canada. But as we swept across the country, playing to crowds that were modest at best, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were working our way down the ladder of success. In the early days, whenever we'd had a bad gig or things looked bleak, we'd half joke, "That's it. Now we're really going down the tubes." Now, with less than enthusiastic press and radio reaction to Caress of Steel, making it tough for our agents to score good spots for us, we dubbed the excursion the Down the Tubes Tour. Mercury's belief in us was clearly on shaky ground, while our management kept us on the road to work off our increasing debt load with decreasing fees. In the days before MTV or Canada's equivalent, Much Music, there was no cross-country music circuit to speak of, and no real coast-to-coast progressive radio network. So not having a sound well-suited to the top 40 meant that the farther we traveled from Toronto, the harder a time we had getting gigs. It was disheartening to pull up again and again to find a small club where we could barely fit our gear on the stage. That smelled like failure. It wasn't wholly a descent into the abyss, because after a bad gig, the next day we might play a better one that buoyed our spirits. But it was definitely a bumpy ride. In our darkest moments, I'd ask myself, was the last good gig the future, or is it this? Rock and roll is not a profession for wusses, I can tell you. If you're looking for a sane and steady lifestyle, try elsewhere. Booked to play the Estevan Civic Auditorium in Saskatchewan, we found the local hockey team had booked a skate around that same afternoon and refused to allow the ice to be boarded over. In Canada, nothing ranks higher than the hometown hockey team, so we had to set up the mixing console on a platform at the edge of the ice at the back and the lighting console in the wings, and did our sound check while the locals skated circles in front of us. When the doors opened, a small crowd took their seats in the stands at the far end of the arena like we were radioactive. From the stage, it looked as if we were playing to empty ice, and it was so cold that when I glanced over at Hearns, he had a blanket over his shoulders and was working the lights with vigor to keep warm. Definitely in the running for most Canadian gig ever. We drove over the prairies past towns with such awesome names as Swift Current, Moose Jaw, Salmon Arm, and Flin Flon. Okay, not Flin Flon. It's way up north, but I love the name. And into the stunning Canadian Rockies. I remember waking up in the car as we were ascending and sticking my head out the window. My jaw dropped at the scale and the gorgeousness of them. I couldn't even see the peaks. That was the very first journey I had taken across my own country, and it took my breath away. Although perhaps what best sums up the sheer Canadianness of that trip was looking out at the audiences in Edmonton and thinking that I had never seen so many ski jackets in one place in my life. In beautiful Vancouver, Nazareth invited us out for some deep sea fishing. I had never once been on a fishing boat, let alone on the Pacific Ocean, but salt water was not what I needed to worry about. Though Nazareth's hard-drinking reputation had preceded them, we manly Canadians reckoned we could hold our own. It was only mid-afternoon when we sailed back into harbor on the verge of passing out, but those beefy dudes from Fife were just getting started. "Good fun, lads," they called out in the hotel lobby. "Bar?" We gave them a big thumbs up and headed straight to our rooms and into a deep and blootered slumber. Over the coming few months across the states, we'd open for Blue Oyster Cult, Iron Butterfly, David Essex, Frank Zappa and the Mothers, REO Speedwagon, ELO, Kansas, Styx, Leonard Skinner, Mott the Hoople, Ted Nugent, and Kiss for the last time. Sometimes it felt as if the world had turned topsy-turvy, like we had entered an episode of our favorite TV show, The Twilight Zone. Prior to arriving in San Antonio, Texas, the local radio station Kiss FM had put us on heavy rotation for 24 hours, and we were thrown a lavish Texas barbecue, treated like superstars, not a band struggling to stay afloat, which in reality, we were. At one venue, a former bowling alley and now a country and western bar, the show was a complete madhouse, with tickets oversold leading to people fighting to get in. A first for us. Thankfully, a third party present calmed everyone down. 10 years before us in the industry, the most your average young musician might expect was a hit or two, and with luck, a couple of years of giddy success. Even the Beatles had plans for when they'd flop. With Twist and Shout at the top of the charts, Ringo Starr was modestly sending money to his aunt in anticipation of opening a hairdressing salon. But by the mid-70s, a career in rock and roll was an actual prospect. We weren't wealthy, but we were making ends meet and signed on for the long haul. It saddened me when one musician I knew packed it in to go work at his father-in-law's chicken business. But I understood why. He was a sideman. He didn't contribute to writing his band's material, while the three of us were wholly vested in our own music, each with as much to lose as there was to gain. That was worth fighting for. If you're a salaryman in music, What's the difference between being that and a salary man somewhere else? If you have mounting bills and pressure from your wife to quit, and home is a sad and stressful place, you may come to throw in the towel more easily. But I had optimism and a supportive partner. I had ideals and dreams to sustain me through times of crisis. Quitting music and taking a straight job was inconceivable to me. I had no other skills. During the Caress of Steel tour, I considered for the first time that the band might fail, but I persisted in the belief that it would not. It was more like, if failure is a possibility, what am I going to do to prevent it? Well, that's the end of chapter 11. Let me know what you thought of this chapter in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.